With this session update, I'm Shannon Lurkey. Members of the State Government Finance and Policy and Elections Committee met to consider a bill that would require a photo ID to register to vote and also to vote. The measure would also create a voter identification card and establish provisional ballots. Here are some highlights from that meeting.
Senate File 173 as amended is an issue or involves an issue that I've been involved with now ever since I got into the Senate. And in 2012, I was the chief author of the voter ID bill that was a constitutional amendment bill that was ultimately placed on the ballot in 2012. That amendment was defeated by the voters. And in 2020, I decided maybe it was time to revisit the issue of voter ID. And so I brought an almost identical version of Senate File 173 as amended forward in 2020. Unfortunately, the voter ID bill, like much of our legislation in 2020, was interrupted by the COVID pandemic. And so we did not move forward with the bill last year. I've simply had it redrafted in 2021 as Senate File 173. And I am bringing it forward at this time for your consideration. I want to outline or list 4 reasons why I'm bringing the bill forward once again. And the first reason is that in the year 2021, we have got new members of the legislature who were not present in 2012. And we also have a new governor. I'd also indicate that in 2012, there were 2 constitutional amendments that were on the ballot. One was the voter ID amendment, and the other one was a marriage amendment, which in 2012 was really quite controversial. So there's 2 questions that occur to me with respect to the 2012 constitutional amendments. The first was, did the marriage amendment have a negative effect on the voter ID amendment, having a negative effect in dragging it down, and as a result, it was defeated? And the other question is, did the voters reject putting voter ID into the Constitution as opposed to having it placed in statute? There's no way to answer either one of those questions, but I do think that they are legitimate questions for consideration in coming forward with a voter ID bill in 2021. The third reason why I'm bringing the bill forward at this time is the genesis of the voter ID bill really comes out of the state of Indiana and an ensuing U.S. Supreme Court case that I'm going to be discussing with you in detail in a few minutes. But that United States Supreme Court case and the Indiana statute that it dealt with is now well over a decade old. And since then, there have been a total of 35 states that have enacted some form of a voter ID bill. We now have completed studies, we've got data, we've got court cases that we did not have in 2012 that address some of the concerns raised in voter ID. The fourth reason that I'm bringing the bill forward at this time is that I think that irrespective of political affiliation or political parties, we all have the same concerns when it comes to voting. And that is, number one, to protect the integrity of our election system. I think that's important to all of us. And the other thing that we think about is the potential disenfranchisement of voters because of the inability to comply with voting laws, or sort of the opposite side of that card, those citizens who are disenfranchised because their legal vote was nullified by an illegally cast and counted vote. I suspect I wouldn't get a whole lot of disagreement on this, but I believe that of all of the constitutional rights that we have, voting rights are probably arguably the most important. If we lose the right to vote and have our votes accurately counted, subsequently, if we were to lose our other constitutional rights, we'd never have a way to get our rights back without the right to vote. And so I really believe that discussing the issue of voting rights, the constitutionality of it, are really very important. And I simply want to have a discussion among us regarding this, what I would characterize as a modern election tool.
11 months ago, I was before this committee on Senator Newman's quite similar voter ID bill. And at that time, I said that although Senator Newman and I respect one another, we had an honest, good faith difference of opinion on this bill. And that's still the case, but there's much, much more. It feels a lot different now than it did then. And that's because this country has seen a tidal wave of disinformation about our democracy, about voting, and about the last election. These are lies designed to manipulate and mislead people. So here is the truth. The truth is that the 2020 election was fundamentally fair, honest, accurate, and secure, period. State and federal courts around the country have examined and re-examined allegations to the contrary and found nothing, no material fraud or misconduct. So this bill, in my judgment, would not do anything to increase our already high level of confidence. What would do that is for all of us to tell the truth about the election and about the election system. So in Minnesota, despite a once-in-a-century pandemic, our voters leaned into the election. For the third time in a row, Minnesota was #1 in America for voter participation, and that's not an accident or a coincidence, at least in some part. That is a measurement of overall confidence in the system. People understand and know in their bones that it is fundamentally fair and fundamentally honest. Otherwise, they wouldn't participate in such high numbers. None of us would. It would be a waste of time. On December 8th, I testified before this committee, differently constituted, obviously. It was right in the middle of the drumbeat of lies designed to discredit the 2020 election. And I said I was concerned about the kind of language that was then being used to whip people into a state of outrage. And I said I thought someone would get killed. And I have never been more sorry to be right. We can have our differences on election policy, and we do, but we can't have differences on the fundamental objective truth. As for this particular bill, I think it's an example of the more you look, the less you like. Voter ID has surface appeal, certainly, but as voters discovered in 2020, the more you look and peel back the layers, the more you discover how dangerous it can be. And that's why I suspect they voted it down. The bill, if enacted, would shut out potentially hundreds of thousands of eligible voters. And let's start with seniors very quickly. I urge all members here to do what I did when I was in the legislature. Every time I was at a senior or assisted living center or a nursing home, I did an informal poll. I said, raise your hand if you have a current ID that reflects this current address where you now live. I never got past 50%. Therein lies a big problem. Provisional balloting. It would create a maybe list. Maybe we'll count them, maybe we won't for the first time in Minnesota history. And it's no wonder that across the country, some 85% of provisional ballots are never counted because people don't want to go to a county office a week after the election, particularly if all the results have been called. They're just not going to do it. So those people will be shut out.
In this particular case, we obviously very strongly disagree with one another. I want to bring to the committee's attention, not once did I bring up the 2020 election. I have not tried to inflame anybody in terms of whether there is truth or lies. And I will tell you candidly, I am not lying when I bring forward this bill. It is a genuine, legitimate issue that I think the people of this state have a right to talk about. And to cast the kinds of aspersions on this bill that Secretary Simon is doing by talking in terms of lies and disinformation really does not do him justice. And candidly, I am offended by that presentation to characterize this bill in light of the 2020 election, which we all know was a very, very difficult time in this country, and I am in no way excusing any of the conduct of people involved.
When I hear words used in my committee of accusing other people of lies, dangers, and other things like that repetitively, it's a great disservice and a great disrespect to the citizens of Minnesota who have an absolute right to ask questions and to try and chill them or keep them from using that by these accusatory kinds of statements for a second time in this committee is not respectful and will not be accepted as the tone of this committee.
Yes or no answer. Does election fraud take place in the state of Minnesota in every election? That is a yes or no question.
It is more complicated than that.
Secretary Simon, the question though is quite specific.
I heard it. Madam Chair, you're not the question cop. The answer is in very, very small.
Secretary Simon, this is
a dozen or two.
The words that we are having right now and calling me as chair of the committee a question cop, really? Secretary Simon, is that really what this is about? I will assume you are not going to answer, and we will go ahead.
If this were a real hearing, you would allow me and others more than 3 minutes. Senator Newman had more than 3 minutes just rebutting.
These are members of the committee, Secretary Simon, and this is not the staff of your office. This is a committee, and please stop interrupting.
I've answered the question.
Secretary Simon, you have an opportunity to answer a question that was addressed. And by the way, I have dealt with this in other committees as well, in other situations, testifiers thinking that because they are on a Zoom committee hearing, that gives them the right to just speak when they want to, interrupt when they want to, and make comments when they want to. That is not the case. This is still a committee hearing. We have a chair and we have members of the committee. And so Senator Osmek has the right to ask a question, and you have a responsibility to answer his question, Secretary Simon.
I just did so, Madam Chair.
All right. Senator Osmek.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So because I didn't get a yes or no answer, I will ask this question again. In every election in Minnesota, does voter fraud occur? That is a yes or no answer.
To a tiny
Please, Secretary Simon, observe committee process. I will call on you to answer the question. Secretary Simon.
Madam Chair and Senator Osmek, to a minuscule extent, the answer is yes.
Among our 2,200 members, those serving the veterans, people with disabilities, the elderly, students, highly mobile populations, and others would find that those that they serve encountering new barriers to voting under this bill. And so while it's popularly assumed to be true, it's not the case that all Minnesotans have government issued photo identification, or that those who don't can attain one with ease if they are provided by the state at no cost.
The ACLU of Minnesota stands firmly opposed to voter ID laws. We fought against the constitutional amendment in 2012, and we are also opposing this one. The voter ID provision of this bill disproportionately harms low-income people, communities of color, especially Indigenous and Black communities, the elderly, people with disabilities, and students. People from those communities are less likely to have a currently valid ID, which take time and money to obtain. People may also often lack the proper documentation needed to obtain proper identification. Even making the voter ID free does not really make it free, because it's not just about the cost of the ID itself. This Senate file also introduces the use of provisional ballots into Minnesota's elections process. It would end Minnesota's long-standing system of allowing all challenge voters to swear an oath that they are eligible, with the consequence of a felony conviction if they are not eligible.
Actual problem that somehow voters are currently disenfranchised by illegal voting. I see no basis to burden our election statutes with voter ID and provisional ballot laws. This is being put forward as a solution in search of a problem. Senator Newman, you said you were bewildered, and I am equally bewildered that we would want to add cost and layers of additional laws when there is no evidence presented that we have a serious problem of people voting without proper ID here in Minnesota. The failure to identify a problem, however, is not because we haven't looked for one. To the contrary, we have a mountain of evidence showing that our voter registration system and elections continue to be conducted with the greatest rigor and bipartisan oversight.
It's well established among election officials that there is no significant voter fraud in Minnesota, as the Secretary of State indicated. Therefore, there is no justification for requiring voter ID, which will be expensive for taxpayers.
I believe that this is, like many, many issues that come before us, a legitimate question. And we have the right to bring bills forward and have discussions amongst us. And those discussions should be civil and courteous.
To continue following these issues and more, watch legislative coverage Monday through Friday on the PBS Minnesota channel or visit our website, www.senate.mn/media.